Between 1877 and 1900, the lives of African Americans in the United States underwent significant changes, marked by a steady erosion of civil and political rights, economic repression, and migration away from the South in search of better opportunities. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 saw the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, which had previously helped to enforce the rights of African Americans. This withdrawal marked the beginning of a new era in which white Southerners rapidly dismantled the civil and political gains African Americans had made during Reconstruction. Southern states implemented a range of discriminatory laws and practices, known collectively as Jim Crow laws, to enforce racial segregation and disenfranchise black citizens. The loss of civil and political rights for African Americans was orchestrated through a combination of legal maneuvers, violence, and intimidation. Southern states adopted a series of measures designed to strip African Americans of their voting rights, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. These laws were purposefully constructed to be difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to meet. Literacy tests were often rigged, with officials arbitrarily deciding whether an answer was correct. Poll taxes required voters to pay a fee to vote, which many African Americans mired in poverty could not afford. The grandfather clause allowed white citizens to bypass these restrictions if their ancestors had voted before the Civil War, a provision that obviously excluded black citizens. Simultaneously, white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan used violence, lynching, and terror to prevent African Americans from exercising their rights or seeking justice in the courts. Economically, African Americans faced severe repression and exploitation. With the collapse of Reconstruction, sharecropping and tenant farming became the dominant forms of employment for African Americans in the South. Sharecropping was a system in which African American farmers rented land from white landowners in exchange for a share of the crop they produced. However, this system was heavily biased in favor of landowners. African Americans often received little more than a fraction of the crop's value, and they were charged exorbitant prices for tools, seeds, and supplies, which they had to buy on credit from the landowner or local stores owned by whites. This kept many African Americans in a cycle of debt and poverty, unable to accumulate savings or own land of their own. The promise of land ownership, which had been held out during Reconstruction as a way to achieve economic independence, remained elusive. The combination of political disenfranchisement, economic repression, and the constant threat of violence pushed many African Americans to consider leaving the South altogether. This period saw the beginning of what would later be known as the Great Migration, although the most significant waves would not occur until the early 20th century. Between 1877 and 1900, thousands of African Americans began to move out of the South to escape the oppressive conditions they faced there. Some moved to the North, attracted by the promise of industrial jobs in cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York, where they hoped to find greater economic opportunities and escape the most severe forms of racial discrimination. Others headed west, inspired by the Exoduster movement of 1879, in which approximately 6,000 African Americans migrated to Kansas and other western states, seeking to establish independent black communities and farm their own land. Despite the challenges they faced, the migration out of the South represented a form of resistance and hope for a better future. African Americans who left the South often found that discrimination and segregation existed in the North and West as well, but the conditions were generally less severe than in the South. In many northern cities, African Americans began to establish their own communities, churches, businesses, and social organizations, laying the foundations for a growing sense of black identity and solidarity that would flourish in the 20th century. While the journey was fraught with challenges, the movement of African Americans out of the South marked the beginning of a new chapter in their quest for freedom, equality, and justice in America.